about some news. Sorry I wasn't here yesterday. I got the COVID-19 vaccine and I was really tired. I got really tired and I had I feel very strong now. So now I'm back after a harrowing weekend. Okay. And we're going to be talking about some news. All right. From Yahoo News, Colorado suspect's family saw him fiddling with gun days before shooting, according to the court documents. This is the 2 days before police say Ahmad al-Alawi Alyssa armed himself with an AR-style semi-automatic rifle and a handgun and donned a tactical vest. Motive is still unclear in the Colorado mass shooting as suspect faces murder charges. And Boulder police finally ID the victims of the mass shooting. National Guardsmen transporting COVID-19 vaccines held at gunpoint. That's crazy. National Guardsmen transporting COVID-19 vaccines through Texas on Monday were held at gunpoint, police said. Oh, my goodness. The U.S. and Iraq are to hold talks over American troop presence. The Biden administration is set to resume strategic talks with Iraqi officials next month on the withdrawal of remaining U.S. combat forces in the country. Smile for this. Bad word for Asian Americans. Florida man hurls racial slurs at Asian woman who asked him to wear a mask. Jesus Christ. These people, I don't understand why people are always going after Asian people about the virus. Just because it originated in China does not mean it's a China virus. Okay? Let's stop hurting Asian Americans, please. And thank you. Okay? Can we just try to stop doing that? Do you think? Maybe, kind of, sort of. It's not their fault. Okay? Let's be realistic. It's really not their fault. All right, what else is going on? In the Boulder shooting, 10 are dead, including a police officer after gun attack in Colorado supermarket. Around the world, Myanmar junta defends crackdown, accuses Aung San Suu Kyi of graft. Death sentence could be reimposed for Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. The Supreme Court said Monday it will consider reinstating the death sentence for Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, presenting President Biden with an early test of his opposition to capital punishment. Senator Tammy Duckworth says she'll vote no on Biden nominees until White House taps Asian candidates. An Asian man, 58, killed while walking with his wife in a hit and run in Texas. Several dead, thousands of homes burn as fire sweeps Rohingya camp. This is getting bad. And down in Bangladesh, this is getting really bad. Those poor refugees. I mean, several dead and thousands of homes burn. Oh. And climate change isn't real, guys. Come on. Get real. Get with the program. Russia and China lash out at destructive U.S. and United Front Against West. And we'll get into that a little bit more. What's going on with Russia and China. 3 Russian bomber pilots killed by ejection system glitch. That's not good. 3 members of a Russian bomber air crew died Tuesday when their ejection seats accidentally activated during pre-flight checks, the military said. Israeli election. Exit polls project narrow Netanyahu victory. Oh my God. What in the hell is going on with Israel? This man is a scumbag. Why do they keep reelecting him? He's even been under investigation for fraud. I don't understand why they keep reelecting him. What is the deal? I'm going to have somebody come on to talk about this. An Asian mom was punched in front of a child on the way to an anti-Asian violence protest in New York City. Ethiopian PM confirms Eritrean troops entered Tigray during conflict. U.S. backs Philippines in standoff over South China Sea reef. Biden administration expelled just 13% of migrant families in the past week. Family of woman fatally shot in Compton demands hate crime investigation. The Netherlands asks Israel about reported confiscation of Palestinian minister's travel pass. Puerto Rico cracks down on tourists flouting pandemic rules. Good on you, Puerto Rico. Poll, Russians increasingly consider China a friend and the U.S. an enemy. That's kind of scary, don't you think? Russians increasingly consider China a friend and the U.S. an enemy. Oh my gosh. Chinese grandma who fought off attacker to donate over $900,000 from a GoFundMe to the AAPI community. That's awesome. U.S. military recorded a lot more UFO sightings than made public, says ex-intelligence director. Not important. Officials, gun and supermarket shooting bought 6 days earlier. So those 3-day waiting periods don't really work, do they? Expulsions, releases, hotels, migrant families at U.S.-Mexico border face mixed U.S. policies. Yeah, isn't that true? Rep. Matt Gaetz, Governor DeSantis regrets even 1 day of the Florida lockdown. Of course he does. Why wouldn't he? Nurse officer dead after inmate attack at Iowa prison. France summons Chinese envoy over unacceptable insults. San Francisco school board member said Asian Americans use white supremacist thinking to get ahead in old tweets. I don't know what that means. Fox News host falsely announces Alejandro Mayorkas' resignation while interviewing Donald Trump. That's not good. Americans who don't receive direct deposit by March 24th will be mailed checks, the Treasury said. The next batch of direct payments from the $1.9 trillion COVID-19 relief package will be sent this week, and Americans who don't receive a direct deposit by March 24th will get the money in a mailed check. Indiana teen faces murder, molesting counts in the death of a girl. A 14-year-old boy was charged with murder and child molestation Monday in the asphyxiation death of a 6-year-old girl in northern Indiana, prosecutors said. My goodness. Indian Premier Modi writes goodwill letter to Pakistani counterpart. Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan received a letter of goodwill from his Indian counterpart Narendra Modi on Tuesday. Interesting. Shalonda Young confirmed as Deputy OMB Director will likely become acting chief. Woman of Asian descent assaulted in New York City on her way to protest anti-Asian violence. White House, North Korea conducted a short-range missile test. Norway, Germany to buy 6 submarines from ThyssenKrupp. Woman beaten, dragged during brazen San Francisco robbery after church. Major teachers union not convinced new CDC's distancing guidelines are effective. There are a lot of teachers are feeling that way. A lot of teachers are feeling that way. If you ever watched Jacobin videos, one of the hosts is a teacher, and he was discussing what this means to him and his fellow teachers in Chicago. And I think that's enough of the latest news for today. A lot of that was really depressing. I'd like to give you some good news, but I don't really have any today. It's amazing to me that we went almost an entire year without any mass shootings. And then all of a sudden in less than a week, just a few days, we've got 2 mass shootings, 8 people dead in the first one, now 10 people dead. If you think we don't have a gun problem in this country, you would be wrong. And on that note, we're going to go to Redneck Revolt. And we're going to read Gun Control's Racist Past and Present. And I'm actually going to screen share that with you so you can see it too. All right. This article was previously run in Al Jazeera. Gun control is again at the forefront of U.S. public discourse following the mass shooting in Las Vegas on Sunday that left 59 people dead and more than 500 wounded. Stephen Paddock, 64, had stockpiled 23 firearms in his 32nd floor room, many with legal bump stocks that served to convert the guns into fully automatic weapons. These upgrades allowed him to wreak havoc on the 22,000 concertgoers at the Route 91 Harvest Country Music Festival for 9 to 11 minutes, Clark County Sheriff Joseph Lombardo said on Tuesday. The mass shooting was the deadliest of its kind in the last 7 decades. The calls for increased gun control have grown louder as the victims are mourned, even from the historically pro-gun country music community. But the country's history reveals a dark side to gun control. The implementation of stricter gun laws has always been marred by accusations of racism. In many cases, regulations were specifically introduced in response to people of color exercising their Second Amendment right to bear arms. Gun ownership is part of the fabric that makes up U.S. identity, with the right to bear arms found in the Constitution's Second Amendment, adopted in 1791. But racism and gun laws predates the founding of the nation. A century earlier, the colony of Virginia had laws prohibiting slaves from owning guns. After being emancipated as a result of the Civil War, 1861 to 65, Southern states passed laws known as the Black Codes, which disarmed and economically disabled African Americans in order to sustain enforcing white supremacy. Saul Cornell, a professor at Fordham University and researcher who focuses on the history of gun control, said, "The story is very complex. Saying gun laws are always racist is just false," he told Al Jazeera. Saying that gun laws have never been racist is also just wrong. Even in the case of laws that are race neutral, meaning they apply to everyone, there are examples of biased enforcement. Cornell explained many point to laws passed in the turbulent 1960s when Black nationalist groups took up arms to defend their communities as examples of racist implementation. The leftist Black Panther Party, whose members carried weapons to guard against police brutality, invaded, in quotations, the California Capitol building in Sacramento in 1967. California's then governor, Ronald Reagan, signed the Mulford Act shortly after that, prohibiting open carry of weapons in public places. The following year would see the passing of the Gun Control Act of 1968, signed by then President Richard Nixon. That law banned Saturday night specials, cheaply made handguns associated with crime in minority communities, as well as barring felons, the mentally ill, and others from owning firearms. Both of these laws were passed by Republicans and supported by the National Rifle Association, the most powerful anti-regulation gun lobby group in the U.S. Not anymore. They filed for bankruptcy. Today, such groups lead the charge to abolish gun restrictions. There is, quote unquote, irony in the fact that right-wing politicians and the NRA were, quote, definitely in favor of gun control when there was a great concern among white Americans, end quote. Claiborne Carson, a Stanford University professor and historian who has devoted his professional life to the study of civil rights campaigner Martin Luther King Jr., told Al Jazeera. The NRA changed policies in the 1970s, adopting its anti-gun control stance. The organization has continued advocating for gun owners, though many have criticized the NRA for failing to speak for armed African Americans. Gun ownership activists have taken to, quote unquote, open carry demonstrations, during which the mostly white activists march in public spaces while carrying assault rifles in recent years. In 2013, a group of armed men from open carry, Texas, trapped 4 pro-gun control women inside a restaurant in Dallas. Carson said that few Black people would survive very long if they conducted similar protests in situations where they were likely to be confronted by police. The silence of the NRA following the 2016 murder of 32-year-old Philando Castile after he clearly disclosed that he had a licensed firearm to Minnesota police officer Geronimo Yanez during a routine traffic stop hammered the point home for many African American gun owners. Outcry from grassroots organizers prompted the NRA to issue a statement calling the events in Minnesota troubling and saying it proudly supports the right of law-abiding Americans to carry firearms for defense of themselves and others, regardless of race, religion, or sexual orientation. Yeah, do you believe that? Carson said it is clear that the notion of openly carrying weapons is a new dimension of gun ownership that is explicitly and increasingly available to white Americans, but implicitly denied to Black Americans. Americans and their guns. American civilians own more guns per capita than any other nation in the world. Each year, more than 30,000 Americans die by guns. Personally own a gun. Yes, 30%. No, 70%. Live in a gun-owning household. Yes, 42%. No, 58%. Have fired a gun. Yes, 72%. No, 28%. Know someone who has been shot. Yes, 44%. No, 56%. Support stricter gun laws. Yes, 52%. No, 48%. Own a gun for protection. Yes, 67%. No, 33%. Nonetheless, African American gun ownership is on the rise today. Throughout much of American history, gun control was a method for keeping Blacks and Hispanics in their place, for lack of a better expression. Tiffany Ware of the Brown Girls Project, an initiative that aims to encourage and inspire Black women and teaches them to responsibly own and use firearms, told Al Jazeera. For many, the near daily news of another Black person killed by police has been motivation to exercise their Second Amendment rights. The Guardian newspaper's The Counted database found that African Americans, who make up around 12% of the country's population, constituted almost a quarter of the 1,092 killed by police in 2016. The U.S. has experienced a noticeable increase in hate crimes in the months following the election of Donald Trump. Ware said that increasingly blatant racism in the U.S. under the Trump administration is another motivating factor. It's driven by fear and a need to protect those that we love, Ware said. With this in mind, BGP began hosting workshops on self-defense, gun ownership, and laws for Black women. We are the organizers of our families. We have to be prepared, Ware added. The complicated relationship between the African American community and gun control makes it difficult to imagine new controls, the BGP's Ware said. When asked what responsible limits would look like, she responded, I really don't know. It seems to me that it's not the people who own firearms legally that are the problem. Ware said she isn't against new controls, and being a gun owner doesn't form an important part of her identity. Motherhood, her community, and career, among other aspects, come first, but systemic biases in the U.S. must be dealt with, she said. Until then, she will continue carrying a weapon. The system is rotten with bias towards people of color. With the knowledge and power that I have with a gun on my hip, I am a protector.
Stats on gun deaths. The United States is in a league of its own. But here's three things you may not be aware of when it comes to the politics behind the gun control debate in the US. First, did you know that the much-cited Second Amendment,
I am extremely pro-Second Amendment,
has provided Americans with an individual right to bear arms for only the last 7 of the country's 239-year history? Yet, prior to a very controversial Supreme Court ruling in 2008, most US Supreme Court justices and attorneys general going back more than 2 centuries agreed that the Second Amendment was about protecting military or militia activities, rather than, say, disturbed young men trying to buy assault rifles at gun shows. Former Supreme Court Chief Justice Warren Burger called the so-called Second Amendment objection to gun control one of the greatest pieces of fraud on the American people by any special interest group. Burger was referring, of course, to the National Rifle Association, the NRA. But did you know that up until the 1970s, the NRA wasn't all that interested in gun rights and more interested in gun safety and, yes, even gun control? In fact, while this is what the NRA boss says now,
American gun owners will never surrender our Second Amendment freedom, period.
This is what the NRA president told Congress back in 1934. Carrying guns should be sharply restricted and only under licenses. So basically, the NRA doesn't agree with the NRA. Third, most US conservatives these days are quick to invoke their hero, former President Ronald Reagan.
I'm a Reagan conservative.
But did you know, and do they know, that Reagan, who remember was shot in the chest in 1981, backed gun control in 1991. In fact, earlier as governor of California, Reagan signed into law a 15-day waiting period on handgun sales. What a traitor. The reality is, Reagan quite liked the idea of background checks, the NRA hasn't always opposed gun control, and the Second Amendment hasn't always meant what people think it means.
Okay. So let's talk for a minute about gun control. We've had a lot of gun laws on the books after all of these mass shootings that we have. Gun control. Not lays. How about laws? Here we go. Let's see. Let's pull up this. We can stop sharing that. Go here. There we go. Too many steps. Sorry about that other step, guys. I forgot to show you the other step. My bad. The other screen share. Okay, this is just about federal gun laws. In the United States, access to guns is controlled by law under a number of federal statutes. These laws regulate the manufacture, trade, possession, transfer, record keeping, transport, and destruction of firearms, ammunition, and firearms accessories. They are enforced by state agencies and the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF. In addition to federal gun laws, all state governments and some local governments have their own laws that regulate firearms. The right to keep and bear arms is protected by the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Scroll down, major federal gun laws. The National Firearms Act taxes the manufacture and transfer of and mandates the registration of Title II weapons such as machine guns, short-barreled rifles and shotguns, heavy weapons, explosive ordnance, suppressors, and disguised or improvised firearms. The Federal Firearms Act of 1938 requires that gun manufacturers, importers, and those in the business of selling firearms have a federal firearms license, prohibits the transfer of firearms to certain classes of people such as convicted felons. The Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 prohibited interstate trade in handguns, increased the minimum age to 21 for buying handguns. Gun Control Act of 1968 focuses primarily on regulating interstate commerce in firearms by generally prohibiting interstate firearms transfers except among licensed manufacturers, dealers, and importers. The Firearm Owners Protection Act, FOPA, 1986, revised and partially repealed the Gun Control Act of 1968, prohibited the sale to civilians of automatic firearms manufactured after the date of the law's passage, required ATF approval of transfers of automatic firearms. Undetectable Firearms Act, 1988, effectively criminalizes, with a few exceptions, the manufacture, importation, sale, shipment, delivery, possession, transfer, or receipt of firearms with less than 3.7 ounces of metal content. Gun-Free School Zones Act, 1990, prohibits unauthorized individuals from knowingly possessing a firearm at a place that the individual knows or has reasonable cause to believe is a school zone. The Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, 1993, requires background checks on most firearm purchasers depending on seller and venue. The federal assault weapons ban that lasted for 10 years from 1994 to 2004 banned semi-automatics that looked like assault weapons and large-capacity ammunition feeding devices. The law expired in 2004. Never should have expired. Why did they put an expiration date on these? Law Enforcement Officers Safety Act of 2004 granted law enforcement officers and former law enforcement officers the right to carry a concealed firearm in any jurisdiction in the U.S., regardless of state or local laws, with certain exceptions. Oh, so cops can carry guns anywhere, everywhere, concealed, whatever. Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act 2005 prevents firearms manufacturers and licensed dealers from being held liable for negligence when crimes have been committed with their products. Of course, let's protect the firearms manufacturers and dealers from being held liable. Let's protect them. Overview of current regulations. Fugitives, those convicted of a felony with a sentence exceeding 1 year past or present, and those who were involuntarily admitted to a mental facility and are prohibited from purchasing a firearm unless rights are restored. 44 states have a provision in their state constitutions similar to the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, which protects the right to keep and bear arms. The exceptions are California, Iowa, Maryland, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York. In New York, however, the statutory civil rights laws contain a provision virtually identical to the Second Amendment. Additionally, the U.S. Supreme Court held in McDonald v. Chicago in 2010 that the protections of the Second Amendment to keep and bear arms for self-defense in one's home apply against state governments and their political subdivisions. Okay, important events regarding gun legislation occurred in the following years. In 1791, the United States Bill of Rights was ratified, which included the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, which stated that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In 1934, with the abundance of gang-related crimes such as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, The National Firearms Act was signed into law under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration. The NFA is considered to be the first federal legislation to enforce gun control in the United States, imposing a $200 tax, equivalent to nearly $4,000 in 2019, on the manufacture and transfer of Title III weapons. It also mandated the registration of machine guns, short-barreled rifles and shotguns, heavy weapons, explosive ordnance suppressors, and disguised or improvised firearms. In 1938, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Federal Firearms Act of 1938 into law, requiring that all gun-related businesses must have a federal firearms license. In 1939, through the court case United States versus Miller, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that Congress could regulate interstate selling sawed-off shotguns through the National Firearms Act of 1934, deeming that such a weapon has no reasonable relationship with the efficiency of a well-regulated militia. In 1968, following the spree of political assassinations, including the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., President Lyndon B. Johnson pushed Congress for the Gun Control Act of 1968. Oh, what about the other people who died? It repealed and replaced the FFA, regulated destructive devices such as bombs, mines, grenades, and other explosives, expanded the definition of machine gun, required the serialization of manufactured or imported guns, banned importing military-style weapons, and imposed a 21 age minimum on the purchasing of handguns from FFLs. The GCA also prohibited selling of firearms to felons and the mentally ill. In 1986, so from 68 to 1986, nothing really happened. In 1986, contrary to prior gun legislation, the Firearm Owners Protection Act, FOPA, passed under the Ronald Reagan administration, enacted protections for gun owners. It prohibited a national registry of dealer records, limited ATF inspections to conduct annual inspections unless multiple infractions have been observed, allowed licensed dealers to sell firearms at gun shows in their states, and loosened regulations on the sale and transfer of ammunition. However, the FOPA also prohibited civilian ownership or transfer of machine guns made after May 19, 1986, and redefined silencer to include silencer parts. In 1993, the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, named after a White House press secretary who was disabled during the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, was signed into law under the presidency of Bill Clinton. This act required that background checks must be conducted on gun purchases and established a criminal background check system maintained by the FBI. In 1994, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act was signed into law under the presidency of Bill Clinton, which included the federal assault weapons ban, effectively banned the manufacturing, selling, and possession of specific military-style assault weapons, such as the AR-15 style rifles, and banned high-capacity ammunition magazines that held over 10 rounds. Banned arms that were previously legally possessed were grandfathered. The ban expired in September 2004. In 2003, the Tiart Amendment, proposed by Kansas Representative Todd Tiart, limited the ATF to only release information from its firearm trace database to only law enforcement agencies or prosecutors in connection with a criminal investigation. Only to law enforcement agencies or prosecutors? What? In 2005, the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act was signed into law under the presidency of George W. Bush. This act protected gun manufacturers from being named in federal or state civil suits by those who were victims of crimes involving guns made by that company. In 2008, the Supreme Court ruled that in the case of District of Columbia v. Heller, that the Second Amendment is an individual right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia, and struck down Washington, D.C.'s handgun ban. But the Supreme Court also stated that the right to bear arms is not unlimited and that guns and gun ownership would continue to be regulated. In 2010, the Supreme Court ruled in the case McDonald v. Chicago that the Second Amendment is incorporated and thus applies against the states. In 2016, the Supreme Court ruled in the case Catano versus Massachusetts that the Second Amendment extends prima facie to all instruments that constitute bearable arms, even those that were not in existence at the time of the founding. All right, and it just keeps going on, and you can read more about this. This is just Wikipedia. So I just wanted to do a little discussion of gun laws. And you see that we actually have enough gun laws. If they were actually implemented, we wouldn't have so many problems. I mean, maybe we could use some new ones, maybe just get rid of all these and start over again. I mean, as a socialist, having weapons is important to us, because we've got to fight the revolution. So don't be afraid of guns. In fact, think about starting what's called a socialist rifle club. I think that's what it's called. Let me look up socialist gun clubs. There's the Socialist Rifle Association. Here, let me share this with you so you can see. I just did a search of socialist gun clubs. Here's the Socialist Rifle Association. Can you see it? Not yet, because I didn't flip the little switch. Gosh, I got to get used to that. There's the Socialist Rifle Association. The workers must be armed and organized. Let's see. Socialist Rifle Association. What does a leftist gun club look like? The John Brown Gun Club. Rise of the Armed Left in 2018. Yes, we need to be armed. So I would highly suggest that we think about arming ourselves. And if your city doesn't have a socialist rifle club, then think about starting one, okay? Socialist rifle clubs, where we can teach gun safety and teach our people how to protect themselves, because we're going to need it, okay? We're going to need it. All right, next we're going to talk about from the World Socialist website, Europe is siding with the U.S. and imposing punitive sanctions against China. So here we go again, right? It never ends. Europe sides with the U.S. in imposing punitive sanctions against China by Peter Simons. Deliberate escalation of geopolitical tensions, the European Union joined the U.S. as well as Britain and Canada in imposing coordinated sanctions against Chinese officials on Monday for alleged human rights abuses against the Muslim Uyghur minority in China's Xinjiang province. The intensifying demonstration of China follows the modus operandi of U.S. imperialism and its allies over the past 3 decades as they have prepared for one criminal war after another in the Middle East, the Balkans, and Central Asia. Here's a picture of Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. I think his actual name is Antony, not Anthony. The sanctions follow a fractious meeting between top U.S. and Chinese officials in Alaska. The talks commenced last Friday with provocative public U.S. condemnations of China across a range of issues, including its treatment of the Uyghurs, claims that were rebutted by China. The 2 days of talks ended without agreement or a joint statement. The U.S. set the stage for the showdown in Alaska by imposing sanctions on Chinese officials over a new law tightening the electoral system in Hong Kong. Now it has targeted Wang Junxing, the Chinese Communist Party secretary of the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, and Chen Mingguo, director of the Xinjiang Public Security Bureau, for serious human rights abuses against Uyghur Muslims. The U.S. froze assets and imposed travel restrictions. In a statement reeking of hypocrisy, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken accused China of continuing to, quote, commit genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, and called on Beijing to, quote, release those arbitrarily held in internment camps and detention facilities. Yeah, that's reeking of pretty big hypocrisy, seeing how we have refugees in internment camps and detention facilities right now. And by the way, when was the last time that China invaded a country and started a war? Think about that for a minute. When you're hearing this stuff or reading this stuff, this propaganda put out by the U.S. government and the war hawks out there, remember, China hasn't started a war. I can't even remember the last time China started a war. Not that they don't have imperialist tendencies. They do. We see it in Africa. Let's not be let's not be ridiculous. China's not that great, but it's not that bad either. Okay? Not as bad as the US. We're worse. While the CCP regime undoubtedly uses police state measures in Xinjiang, as it does more broadly against the Chinese working class, Washington, which is guilty of war crimes in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere, is again selectively exploiting human rights to advance its imperialist interests. Blinken's accusation of Uyghur genocide by China, a designation only made by former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in the dying days of the Trump administration, is intentionally inflammatory. While the term conjures up images of mass killings, it rests on nothing more than grossly distorted and largely unsubstantiated claims that China's birth control methods in Xinjiang constitute genocide. The European Union has cynically jumped on board the U.S. human rights wagon as a means of extracting concessions from the U.S. as the Biden administration seeks to revitalize relations with Europe that soured under Trump. Significantly, the coordinated sanctions on China were announced immediately prior to Blinken landing in Brussels for talks with European officials. The EU formally announced travel and asset sanctions against 4 Chinese officials, including 2 punished by the US. These are the first EU penalties against China since 1989, when the European authorities imposed an arms embargo following the Tiananmen Square massacre. The EU statement stopped short of accusing China of genocide, but alleged that Beijing was responsible for, quote, arbitrary detentions and degrading treatments of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities, as well as systematic violations of their religious freedom. The U.S. also released a joint statement condemning China by Blinken and the foreign ministers of the so-called Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, consisting of the U.S., Britain, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. This is something I need to look into. The Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. Which makes up, consisting of the U.S., so it's the U.S., it's Britain, of course, always on our side for whatever reason, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Oh. Country's so white. Wonder why they picked those countries. The UK and Canada have imposed their own sanctions on China, but Australia and New Zealand have yet to do so. The joint statement declared, the evidence, including from the Chinese government's own documents, satellite imagery, and eyewitness testimony, is overwhelming. China's extensive program of repression includes severe restrictions on religious freedoms, the use of forced labor, mass detention and internment camps, forced sterilizations, and the concerted destruction of Uyghur heritage. The evidence, in fact, is far from overwhelming. Eyewitness accounts derive in the main from Uyghur exiles associated with CIA-funded organizations such as the World Uyghur Congress and the American Uyghur Association, while satellite photos and supposedly leaked Chinese documents provide no direct evidence and are inevitably interpreted through the jaundiced eyes of pro-U.S. analysts. In the absence of independent evidence, no more faith should be placed on Western propaganda than claims by the Chinese government that no abuses are taking place. The Chinese government immediately hit back, accusing the EU of disregarding and distorting the facts and grossly interfering in China's internal affairs. Beijing imposed its own sanctions on 10 European politicians and individuals, as well as 4 entities. The latter included the right-wing pro-U.S. Alliance of Democracies Foundation, established in 2017 by former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Among the individuals sanctioned by China was Adrian Zenz, a right-wing German academic and self-described born-again Christian. While he claims that he was led by God to research into Chinese minorities, Zenz has undoubtedly been driven by more earthly motives. He is well connected in anti-communist circles in Europe and the U.S., including to the Anti-Communist Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. U.S. and European allegations against China rely heavily on his tendentious research. With the latest round of sanctions barely announced, the Biden administration hinted that more is to come. Yesterday, White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki, after reiterating Washington's grave concerns over China's treatment of Uyghurs, stated, "We will be evaluating that the appropriate next steps are in close coordination with our allies around the world." Less than 3 months in office, the extraordinary rapidity with which the Biden administration is ramping up the U.S. confrontation with China, as well as Russia, has even surprised some hardened U.S. propagandists. David Sanger, chief Washington correspondent for the New York Times, entitled his comment yesterday, "That was fast. Blow-ups with China and Russia in Biden's first 60 days." Sanger declared that the U.S. has entered a new era of bitter superpower competition, marked by perhaps the worst relationship Washington has had with Russia since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and with China since it opened diplomatic relations with the United States. Sanger also pointed, at least indirectly, to the underlying driving force for the escalating U.S. war drive against China, the fear in Washington that the Chinese economy will eclipse that of the U.S. within a decade. "The power of the Chinese," he wrote, "arises not from their relatively small nuclear arsenal or their expanding stockpile of conventional weapons. Instead, it arises from their expanding economic might." Sanger highlighted China's growing expertise in high-tech areas, such as 5G technology, that are critical to the U.S. maintaining its global economic and strategic dominance. The speed with which the Biden administration is ratcheting up its anti-China propaganda, alongside the expansion of its military forces in Asia, flows from a sense in Washington that time is running against it. U.S. imperialism cannot tolerate any threat to its hegemony and is prepared to use all means, including military conflict, to subordinate China. Outside of the political intervention of the international working class on the basis of a unified socialist perspective, the world is rapidly descending into war between nuclear-armed powers. So we see another kind of icky, riling up China and Russia. I mean, do we honestly think that this is a good thing? Do we want war against China? Because I'm telling you right now, they have more people than we do. There's like 1 billion Chinese people, and there's only 330 million Americans or less, given the pandemic that we bungled so badly. Well, we didn't. Trump did, and now Biden's kind of bungling it too. We're supposedly the richest country in the world, and we can't do half of what China did for their people. Not even half, not even a quarter. We can't do what other nations do for their people. Do you understand that? We're the world's biggest superpower, and we can't do for our people what smaller countries like Norway, what smaller countries like Taiwan can do for their people. Taiwan has free universal healthcare. It doesn't matter if you're Taiwanese. They don't care. They will serve you. They will help you. They will do what they need to do. And we need that here in the US. We need Medicare for all. All right. But next we're going to move on to common dreams. Sorry, guys. I'm like, things are just so stressful anymore. I mean, they're just stressful for all of us. All right. So this article comes from Common Dreams, and it was posted today. And it's written by Kenny Stansel, a staff writer at Common Dreams. Don't need to wait another minute. Biden calls on Congress to pass assault weapons ban. Our nation is being held hostage by the gun industry, and until the industry is held fully accountable for the direct role it plays in these massacres, communities across the nation will continue to live in fear of the next horrendous attack. Here's a picture. A person is loaded onto a stretcher after a gunman opened fire at a King Soopers grocery store on March 22nd, 2021 in Boulder, Colorado. In the wake of yet another mass shooting in which a 21-year-old gunman armed with an AR-15 style rifle fatally shot 10 people at a grocery store in Boulder, Colorado, President Joe Biden on Tuesday called on Congress to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines and to enact additional gun safety reforms, including improved background checks. I don't need to wait another minute, let alone an hour, to take common sense steps that will save lives in the future and to urge my colleagues in the House and Senate to act, Biden said during a White House press conference following Monday's shooting. We can ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines in this country once again. I got that done when I was a senator. We should do it again. As The Hill reported Tuesday, Biden called on the Senate to immediately pass 2 House-passed bills that would expand background checks for firearm sales, noting that both passed the Democratic-controlled lower chamber with some Republican support. One of the bills would close the so-called Charleston loophole by extending the initial background check review period from 3 to 10 days. This is a good thing. The bill is linked to the 2015 shooting in Charleston, South Carolina, in which a white supremacist killed 9 Black Americans at the Mother Emanuel AME Church. Excuse me. On Monday afternoon in Boulder, 10 people, including a city police officer who responded to the scene, were gunned down at a local supermarket in the Rocky Mountain College town. Colorado has been home to several mass shootings since 1999, when 12 students and a teacher were killed at Columbine High School. According to the Daily Poster, the carnage in Boulder came less than a week after the National Rifle Association took credit for helping to strike down the city's assault weapons ban. Our nation is being held hostage by the gun industry, and while the industry is being fully accountable for the direct role it plays in these massacres, communities across the nation will continue to live in fear for the next horrendous attack, Violence Prevention Center Executive Director Josh Sugarman said Tuesday in a statement. In the past week alone, 2 mass shootings have killed at least 18 people, wounded at least 1 more, and devastated our country, while other types of gun violence continue to kill more than 100 people in the U.S. every day. Shannon Watts, Moms Demand Action. According to the Gun Violence Archive, the Boulder massacre, which occurred just days after a gunman murdered 8 people, the majority of whom were Asian women, in a shooting spree at 3 separate spas in metro Atlanta, was the 102nd mass shooting in the U.S. in 2021. It was the 102nd mass shooting in the U.S. in 2021. 102nd, and we're only in March 23rd. Oh my God, that's a lot of shootings. Data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention shows that firearms accounted for nearly 40,000 deaths in the U.S. in 2019. Yet the COVID-19 pandemic led to an increase in gun violence, along with an unprecedented spike in online gun purchases. Ernest Coverson, manager of Amnesty International USA's End Gun Violence Program, said Tuesday in a statement. Many gun owners, including first-time buyers, were able to get their hands on firearms without undergoing necessary training or background checks. The recent spate of mass shootings, as Common Dreams reported earlier Tuesday, has intensified pressure on Democrats to use their slim majority in the Senate to finally eliminate the 60-vote filibuster rule and approve substantial gun safety laws over foreseeable GOP obstruction. It just so happened that prior to the recent killing spree in Boulder, the Senate Judiciary Committee had already scheduled a hearing on gun violence for Tuesday. Only in America does the Senate schedule a gun violence prevention hearing on a random Tuesday, and it ends up falling within a day of another mass shooting. We need action. We need gun reform now. Public Citizen, March 23rd. During his opening statement at the hearing, Senator Richard Blumenthal, D. Connecticut, said that inaction by this Congress makes us complicit. And yes, it does. Blumenthal recounted how in the immediate aftermath of the 2012 massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School, which left 20 children and 6 teachers dead, a mother who had been traumatized by the school shooting told him that she was ready now to take action to address gun violence. When I asked a mom after Sandy Hook whether she would talk to me when she was ready about action we could take together, she said through her tears, "I'm ready now." Listen to at Senator Blumenthal's powerful opening remarks at the Senate hearing to end gun violence. Senate Judiciary Committee. That sentiment was shared by many this week. Following the White House's remarks Tuesday, Everytown for Gun Safety Chief John Feinblatt said in a statement that President Biden is right. This is the moment to act on gun safety. To end these senseless killings, we need more than thoughts and prayers, he added. We need the Senate to pass background checks, and we need this administration to take executive action to save lives. Shannon Watts, the founder of Moms Demand Action, concurred that we cannot wait a moment longer. In the past week alone, 2 mass shootings have killed at least 18 people, wounded at least 1 more, and devastated our country, while other types of gun violence continue to kill more than 100 people in the U.S. every day, Watts said. There is no key legislation that will end gun violence overnight, but there are steps Congress can take right now to save lives. Ernest Coverson, Amnesty International. At the beginning of Tuesday's hearing, Senator Dick Durbin, D. Illinois, chairman of the committee and second highest ranking Democrat in the upper chamber, said that prayer leaders have their important place in this, but we are Senate leaders. What are we doing? We won't solve this crisis with prosecutions after funerals, Durbin added. We need prevention before shooting. While gun violence continues to traumatize communities across the country, Coverson pointed out it's been 25 years since the federal government passed a gun safety law. Now more than ever, lawmakers must prioritize gun safety solutions, Coverson continued. There is no key legislation that will end gun violence overnight, but there are steps Congress can take right now to save lives. Amnesty has called on the Senate to pass the Break the Cycle of Violence Act, which Coverson said would support on-the-ground groups working to keep communities safe from gun violence and make a long-term and life-changing impact on marginalized and underserved groups. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, D. New York, for his part, vowed to address the epidemic of gun violence, noting that he has already committed to bringing universal background checks legislation to the floor of the Senate. We'll see. 25 years is a long time, Chuck. Long time, Joe. Long time, Nancy. Long time. Come on, guys. During his address on Tuesday, Biden said that those poor folks who died left behind families. That leaves a big hole in their hearts. Okay, Captain Obvious. Those families who are mourning today because of gun violence in Colorado and Georgia and all across the country, we have to act so there's not more of you. There's fewer of you as time goes on, the president added. Well. Okay. Well, that's all the news I have for you today. The last thing we're going to end with is what's happening in working class history today. Let's find out, shall we? Today is March 23rd. All right. March 23rd, 1931, Indian revolutionary socialist Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev Tharpar, and Shivaram Rajguru were executed by British colonial authorities in what is now Punjab, Pakistan. They had been sentenced to death for assassinating a senior British police officer in 1928 to avenge the police killing of Lala Lajpat Rai during an anti-colonial demonstration. While they opposed British colonialism rather than narrow nationalism, they advocated working-class revolution against both British and Indian capitalists. They were all just 22 or 23 years old. Following their sentencing, Mohandas Gandhi appealed to the Viceroy of India to commute their sentences, but he also appealed to huge crowds not to take action to secure their release, as he had signed a truce agreement with the authorities. After they were executed, Gandhi was greeted by a crowd he described as incensed, flying black flags and shouting, "Gandhi, go back, down with Gandhiism." Gandhi's truces sent Bhagat Singh to gallows, and long live Bhagat Singh. After the execution, Bhagat Singh in particular became a national hero. And here he is, Bhagat Singh, national hero of India. March 23rd, 1944, the most significant attack on Nazi occupation forces by the Italian partisan resistance took place on Via Rasala in Rome. Around a dozen of the communist-led partisan Gruppi di Azione Patriottica, the Patriotic Action Groups, GAP, attacked an SS company of over 150 ethnic Germans that was tasked with fighting the resistance. The partisans detonated a homemade bomb and then opened fire with mortars, hand grenades, and guns before vanishing. The resistance unit suffered no casualties, while over 30 SS members were killed and more than 100 wounded. Unable to capture those responsible, the following day, the enraged Nazis massacred 335 people, some of whom had been arrested for resistance activities, but most of whom were unrelated civilians. Well, they certainly went on. They were very enraged. They killed 335 people. Jesus Christ. That's all for today, my lovely friends and watchers. I will be back again tomorrow with another video for your viewing pleasure. This has been The Future is Socialist, and I'm your host, Emberly McCullough, and I will see you again tomorrow at 1600 or 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again tomorrow.